She's just a washed-up extra living in my shadow, my brother joked to the flashing cameras at his movie premiere. The Hollywood elite laughed, completely ignoring me at my dark table near the service doors. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I just took a sip of my water and smiled, because in exactly 10 minutes, the legendary studio chief was going to walk through those doors, completely ignore my brother's outstretched hand, and hand me the deed to his entire production company. I didn't come to his premiere to celebrate him. If you have ever been erased to make someone else shine, where are you listening from? Let me know below. The massive LED screen behind the podium flickered to life. The room fell into a reverent hush as the opening scene of Trevor's highly anticipated masterpiece began to play. The cinematography was flawless, the lighting expensive, and the score sweeping. But I was not looking at the visuals. I was listening to the words. The lead actor leaned against a rain-slicked window and delivered a monologue about fractured loyalties and forgotten promises. Every single syllable hit my ears like a familiar, rhythmic echo. I knew the cadence. I knew the exact pause before the final sentence. I knew it because I had typed those exact words on a battered typewriter 8 years ago. I remembered the faded ink. I remembered the slight misalignment of the letter E on my keyboard. Back then, the script was just a stack of bound paper sitting on my desk. It was a deeply personal project I had poured my soul into during a very dark time. Now, it was a multi-million-dollar production being projected to the most powerful people in Hollywood. Trevor took the microphone again as the clip ended. He placed a hand over his heart, looking genuinely moved by his own performance. He told the crowd about his grueling creative process. He spoke about how the story came to him in a dream, how he spent years refining the dialogue, agonizing over every character arc until it was perfect. "This film," Trevor declared, his voice thick with practiced emotion, "is the most personal piece of art I have ever created. It is my legacy." The audience erupted into a standing ovation. Influential producers nodded in approval. Critics jotted down glowing notes. I remained seated in the shadows. I did not clap. I did not cry. I simply took a slow sip of my water, tasting the cold rim of the glass. Listening to someone else claim your life's work would normally break a person. It would usually prompt a scream, a public scene, or a tearful exit to the parking lot. But panic is strictly for those who do not have a solid plan. I had moved past anger a long, long time ago. Anger is loud, sloppy, and easily dismissed. Strategy is utterly silent. I looked down at the heavy leather briefcase resting by my feet. Inside that case lay the original copyright registration, stamped and dated by the federal government 8 years prior. It was absolute, undeniable proof of ownership. Trevor was currently basking in the glow of a stolen sun, completely unaware that he had built a fragile glass house directly on top of a legal minefield. Every round of applause he received tonight was just another nail in his professional coffin. He was proudly documenting his own intellectual property theft in front of hundreds of high-definition cameras. I watched him soak in the endless praise, feeling a strange, absolute calm wash over me. He truly believed he had buried me in the background. He had no idea I held the deed to the entire theater. Who opened my desk? The applause finally died down, and the string quartet resumed playing soft, elegant music. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved through the tables, pouring expensive champagne. I kept my gaze fixed on my water glass when a shadow fell across my table. It was Kelsey, Trevor's wife. She wore a custom designer gown that easily cost more than a luxury car. Her makeup was flawless, specifically designed to look effortless for the cameras. She stood over me, a perfectly manicured hand resting on her hip. Her lips curved into a practiced, pitying smirk. "Luna," Kelsey sighed, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. I am so glad you decided to come out of hiding, though, I must admit, I am a little surprised you chose to wear that. She let her eyes drift up and down my simple, unbranded black dress. It was a calculated move, meant to make me feel small. It was exactly the kind of behavior that played well with her millions of online followers. It fits the occasion, I replied evenly. My voice did not waver. I did not offer her a defensive explanation. Kelsey let out a soft, mocking laugh. Well, Trevor is just too generous, letting you sit in the room while he makes history. I hope you are taking notes. You could learn a lot from his work ethic. I smiled politely. I let her have her moment of perceived superiority. What Kelsey did not know was that just 3 hours before this gala, my financial manager, Yvonne, had sent me a very interesting secure file. For months, the internet had been flooded with vicious, coordinated rumors about my supposed mental decline. Anonymous blogs claimed I was deeply jealous of Trevor. Fake accounts spread stories that I was broke, unstable, and desperately trying to ride his coattails back into the spotlight. It was a highly effective smear campaign that had effectively blacklisted me from traditional casting calls. Yvonne had traced the digital footprints. The file in my briefcase did not just contain copyright documents. It held a neatly organized stack of invoices. Invoices from Kelsey's boutique media agency, paying offshore bot farms to trend those exact negative hashtags. We had the email chains. We had the explicit directives containing the exact talking points. We had the scheduled posting calendars. Kelsey had built her entire online persona around being a champion for women's empowerment. She sold lifestyle brands based on kindness and authenticity. Yet, here she was, the architect of a systematic digital assassination against her husband's sister. She leaned in slightly, her expensive perfume cloying in the air. Enjoy the free meal, Luna. It is the closest you will ever get to an A-list table again. I looked directly into her eyes. I saw the absolute certainty she held in her own constructed reality. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she was the smartest person in the room. I felt no urge to correct her. Thank you, Kelsey, I said quietly. I am savoring every single minute. She turned on her heel and glided back toward the flashing cameras. Her empire was paper. As Kelsey disappeared into the crowd, a reporter from a major entertainment network slipped past the security perimeter and approached my table. He held a microphone tightly, his eyes gleaming with the promise of a sensational soundbite. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew the narrative that had been carefully fed to the press for years. Luna, a moment please, he asked, not waiting for an invitation. People are surprised to see you here tonight, considering your extended hiatus. Is it true that Trevor has been financially supporting you since your emotional breakdown 4 years ago? He thrust the microphone toward my face. 4 years ago, that question would have sent me into a spiral of defensive panic. I would have tried to explain. I would have tried to plead for the truth. Now, I just looked at the blinking red recording light. You might want to ask his accountants, I said, my tone completely flat and measured. They know exactly who has been supporting whom. The reporter frowned, clearly confused by the lack of tears or outrage. Before he could press further, a security guard ushered him away. I watched him go, my mind drifting back to the origin of that pervasive breakdown myth. 4 years ago, I did not lose my mind. I simply gained my boundaries. I had sat in a sterile attorney's office across from Kenneth and Cynthia. I had calmly informed them that my bank accounts were no longer a communal family fund. I refused to sign over another percentage of my royalties to fund Trevor's extravagant lifestyle. I stopped paying the mortgage on the sprawling estate they lived in. I closed the corporate credit cards they used for endless luxury vacations. I cut the financial cord. It was a quiet, necessary act of self-preservation. Kenneth had slammed his fists on the mahogany table. Cynthia had accused me of abandoning my blood. When they realized I would not budge, they did not mourn the loss of their daughter. They panicked over the loss of their primary revenue stream. To protect their image, they needed a cover story. A successful actress stepping away from the spotlight to focus on writing and producing was respectable. But a crazy, unstable actress who had to be quietly hidden away by her loving family, that was a tragic, marketable narrative. Kenneth and Cynthia planted the stories. They gave tearful, anonymous quotes to tabloids about how hard it was to watch a loved one lose their grip on reality. They weaponized mental health to explain my sudden disappearance, completely erasing the fact that I had chosen to walk away from their systematic exploitation. They built a cage of rumors to keep me trapped in the public's pity. They told the world I was broken so no one would ask why I stopped working for free. They needed me to be a tragedy so Trevor could remain the golden child. I let them tell their lies. I let the industry believe I was washed up. I used their carefully crafted illusion of my defeat as the ultimate camouflage. They thought I was hiding. I was simply rebuilding. My gaze shifted back to Trevor on the main stage. He was currently charming a group of influential distributors, flashing that signature, rehearsed smile. Looking at him now, it was almost impossible to reconcile this polished producer with the terrified amateur he used to be. The memory surfaced uninvited, sharp and cold. It was 10 years ago, on the set of Trevor's first major studio film. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The set was freezing, smelling of stale coffee and burnt electrical tape. The director had called cut for the 14th time. Trevor was stumbling through a crucial emotional scene, his delivery stiff, his eyes darting frantically off camera. He could not remember his lines, and when he did, they sounded incredibly hollow. The crew was exhausted. The studio executives were threatening to pull the funding and recast the role entirely. Kenneth pulled me into a cramped, dimly lit trailer. He did not ask for my help. He demanded it. "You need to fix this, Luna," Kenneth had ordered, his voice tight with desperation. "His career is over before it even starts. You know how to write. You know how to act. Get out there and make him look good." For the next 3 weeks, I practically lived on that set. I did not sleep. While Trevor rested in a luxury trailer, I sat in a plastic chair, furiously rewriting his dialogue to mask his limited range. During the actual shoots, I stood just out of the camera's frame. I fed him lines. I mirrored the emotions he was supposed to feel, coaching him through every blink and every breath. I became his invisible crutch. I gave him the performance that launched his entire career. When the film wrapped, there was no celebration for me. Instead, Kenneth handed me a dense legal document. It was a non-disclosure agreement, drafted by the studio's fiercest lawyers. "This is just standard procedure," Kenneth had said smoothly, pushing a heavy gold pen into my hand. "To protect the family brand, we cannot have people thinking Trevor didn't do the work himself. It would ruin his marketability. You understand? Right. It is for the greater good." I was young, exhausted, and desperately craving my father's approval. I wanted to believe that my sacrifice meant I belonged. I believed the lie that protecting my brother was the exact same thing as protecting myself. I signed the paper, legally erasing my own relentless hard work and creative contributions to his overnight success. That film made Trevor a star, It secured him millions in future lucrative contracts. The director publicly praised his raw, natural talent on national television. No one knew about the handwritten script notes I had left behind in his trailer. No one knew about the young woman standing in the shadows, silently mouthing the words he ultimately won awards for. I looked at the champagne bubbling in my glass. The exploitation had not started with the stolen script tonight. It had started a decade ago, in that freezing trailer, when I was explicitly taught that my only value was what I could quietly hand over to someone else. My family had turned my talent into a donor organ for my brother's ambition. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the bitter memory fade back into the past. I was done being quiet. The room was filled with the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of wealthy guests. From my secluded table, I watched Kenneth and Cynthia sitting in the front row, beaming up at Trevor. They looked like the perfect, supportive parents. To the rest of the world, they were just two devoted people who had sacrificed everything to raise a Hollywood star. But I knew the exact cost of their sacrifices, because I was the one who paid for them. Psychologists have very clinical terms for what happens in families like mine. They call it the dynamic of the golden child and the scapegoat. Trevor was the golden child. He could do no wrong. His minor achievements were celebrated as strokes of genius, while his massive failures were always blamed on someone else. I, on the other hand, was the scapegoat. My purpose was solely to absorb the blame and generate the resources necessary to keep the golden child shining. When I first started acting as a teenager, I booked several successful television roles. The checks were substantial. I never saw a single dime of that money. Kenneth and Cynthia managed my accounts under the guise of family funds. They convinced me that this was simply how loving families operated. They normalized the financial theft by calling it loyalty. I later discovered that my childhood earnings paid for Trevor's expensive acting coaches. My residuals paid for his high-end public relations firm, the sprawling, gated estate they currently lived in, the one they proudly showed off to architectural magazines, was purchased entirely with my income. I had bought the house. Yet I was always treated like an ungrateful guest living under their roof. The trap of normalizing cruelty is incredibly effective. When exploitation is consistently wrapped in the language of love and familial duty, it becomes almost impossible to recognize it as abuse. You are conditioned to believe that your exhaustion is just part of being a good sister. You are taught that setting a boundary is an act of ultimate betrayal. Kenneth and Cynthia did not just steal my money or my scripts. They stole my fundamental understanding of what a family was supposed to be. They built an entire business model on my guilt, expertly manipulating my desperate desire to finally be seen and valued by my own parents. They demanded endless emotional and financial subsidies, and whenever I faltered, they reminded me of how much they supposedly loved me. I sat in the shadows of the gala, watching my mother dab a perfectly dry eye with a silk tissue as Trevor spoke. There was no love in that front row. There was only the anxious maintenance of a highly profitable brand. They had traded a daughter for a celebrity status, and they were terrified of losing their investment. I looked at them and felt absolutely nothing. The anger had evaporated years ago, replaced by a cold, quiet clarity. I finally understood the game they had been playing my entire life. I stopped buying the illusion. The transition from a highly visible actress to a completely invisible architect did not happen overnight. It was a methodical, deliberate erasure. I did not simply fade away into obscurity. I strategically changed my operating system. When I finally cut the financial cord 4 years ago, Kenneth and Cynthia immediately spun their narrative. They flooded the tabloids with tragic stories about my emotional instability. They painted a picture of a fragile woman who simply could not handle the immense pressures of Hollywood. They expected me to fight back. They expected me to release frantic public statements, hire crisis managers, and engage in a messy, highly publicized media war. I did absolutely none of that. I embraced the ghost they created. While they were busy talking to journalists about my supposed breakdown, I was sitting in a soundproof office in downtown Los Angeles with Malcolm and Yvonne. Malcolm was a razor-sharp entertainment lawyer who specialized in complex corporate structures. Yvonne was a brilliant financial manager who understood the intricate flow of Hollywood capital better than anyone. They were the first two people in the industry who did not look at me and see a naive actress to be managed, or a convenient cash machine to be drained. They looked at me and saw a creator. They saw a strategist. Together, we began building the fortress. We established a complex network of anonymous holding companies. We created limited liability corporations layered beneath other limited liability corporations. We set up blind trusts that completely shielded my identity from public records. Through these invisible entities, I began to acquire power. I did not buy mansions or sports cars. I bought distressed scripts. I purchased the international distribution rights to undervalued independent films. I slowly and systematically acquired the debt of various mid-tier production studios. I poured every ounce of my energy, my remaining capital, and my deep industry knowledge into understanding the mechanics of ownership. In Hollywood, the people whose faces are plastered on the movie posters rarely hold the actual power. The true power belongs to the people who own the paper. It belongs to the individuals holding the intellectual property rights and the secured loans. Malcolm handled the aggressive legal filings, ensuring every contract was watertight. Yvonne managed the acquisitions, moving funds so quietly that the industry trade papers never picked up a single trace of our activity. I provided the vision and the initial capital. We worked in total silence, while Trevor continued to pose on red carpets, completely oblivious to the empire being constructed right beneath his feet. I traded the spotlight for absolute leverage. I let them think I was a broken, washed-up extra hiding from the world. In reality, I was carefully studying the blueprints of the entire industry, preparing to buy the very ground they walked on. They built the perfect ghost. Trevor gripped the microphone, leaning casually against the podium. He paused, letting a charming, self-deprecating smile wash over his face. "You know, it has not always been easy," Trevor told the silent room, his voice taking on a husky, emotional tone. "A few years ago, I hit a rough patch. I had 3 projects back-to-back that just did not connect with audiences. The industry was ready to write me off, but I kept pushing. I survived the lean years purely on faith and relentless hard work. The audience offered a murmur of sympathetic agreement. A few actors nodded, relating to the familiar Hollywood struggle. I took another sip of my water, my expression unchanged. The sheer audacity of his rewritten history was almost impressive. Those lean years he was romanticizing were not just a rough patch. They were catastrophic failures. 3 consecutive box office bombs had completely drained his production company. The major studios had officially pulled their backing. His creditors were circling, ready to dismantle his assets. Trevor was less than 48 hours away from declaring total bankruptcy and facing a barrage of devastating lawsuits from unpaid vendors. He did not survive through faith or relentless hard work. He survived because of a sudden, mysterious cash injection from an anonymous offshore investment fund. That anonymous fund belonged to me. Through Yvonne's meticulous financial maneuvering, I had secretly purchased his company's outstanding debt. I infused millions of dollars into his failing projects, perfectly masking the origin of the money. I did not do it to save my brother's ego. I did not care if Trevor's name remained on the A-list. I did it because those 3 failing films employed over 600 crew members. There were single mothers working in the makeup department. There were aging stunt coordinators relying on that health insurance. There were hundreds of hard-working technicians who would have lost their homes and their livelihoods simply because Trevor was an incompetent producer who vastly overspent his budgets. I saved those films to protect the innocent people trapped in his sinking ship. Trevor, naturally, assumed the anonymous bailout was simply proof of his undeniable artistic value. He believed the universe had stepped in to save his genius. He never once bothered to question where the miraculous funding actually came from. He just took the money, paid himself his exorbitant producer fees, and carried on living in his delusion of grandeur. Now, he stood on a glittering stage, wearing a bespoke tuxedo, actively mocking the sister who was supposedly living in a basement. He was publicly humiliating the exact same person who had quietly paid the salaries of his entire crew. He was biting the invisible hand that had literally kept his career from disintegrating into dust. I watched him soak in the applause, feeling a profound sense of closure. He was completely blind to the reality of his own existence. I owned his second chances. My eyes drifted away from the stage and settled back on Ivy. She was still standing near the service doors, wearing a simple, unbranded dress, clutching a clipboard tightly to her chest. She looked exhausted, her posture rigid with a mix of fear and forced professional compliance. To the elite guests in this room, Ivy was invisible. She was just another nameless assistant hired to fetch coffee and manage the chaotic schedules of the talent. But I knew exactly who she was. And I knew exactly what Trevor had stolen from her. 6 months ago, Ivy was not an assistant. She was a brilliant, fiercely talented young actress who had just won the lead role in Trevor's new film after a grueling, blind audition process. The director loved her raw authenticity. The casting department fought for her. It was supposed to be her breakout moment. Then, Trevor called her into a closed-door meeting at his private production office. He did not talk about character motivation or script dynamics. Instead, he slid a thick public relations contract across the desk. He calmly explained that to secure the lead role, she needed to become his media companion. He demanded a highly publicized, entirely fabricated romantic relationship. She would have to attend every red carpet on his arm, post specific adoring messages on her social media, and surrender her personal life to his public relations team for the next 2 years. It was a blatant, calculated abuse of professional power. It was textbook coercion. Ivy, showing incredible professional integrity, politely refused the fabricated romance. She wanted the job based on her acting merits, not a fake scandal. The retaliation was swift and merciless. The very next morning, Ivy was officially labeled difficult to work with. Trevor personally ordered the casting department to permanently delete her audition files from the secure servers. The lead role was immediately handed over to a popular social media influencer who happened to share the same management agency as Kelsey. Trevor did not fire Ivy entirely. That would have been too easy. Instead, he demoted her to a lowly set assistant, knowing full well she desperately needed the union health insurance to pay for her mother's medical treatments. He trapped her in a position of humiliation, forcing her to serve coffee to the influencer who had stolen her rightfully earned role. He exploited her financial vulnerability to punish her for setting a professional boundary. When Malcolm discovered what had happened to Ivy during our covert audit of the studio's files, a cold, familiar recognition settled into my bones. I looked at Ivy's trembling hands. I saw the exact same exhaustion I had felt in that freezing trailer 10 years ago. I saw another young woman whose talent was being actively crushed to inflate Trevor's massive, fragile ego. Trevor believed he could simply erase women who refused to serve his narrative. He thought there were no consequences for destroying a career in the shadows. I came to collect. We built this studio on trust, transparency, and absolute creative control. Trevor proudly announced to the room, gesturing expansively with his hands. When I signed my new contract last year, I made sure it reflected those exact values. A few studio executives in the audience offered polite, tight-lipped smiles. Trevor was gloating, completely misreading the underlying tension in the room. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the entire corporate structure of Hollywood. A year ago, riding high on the fabricated success of a film I had anonymously bailed out, Trevor decided to play hardball. He demanded a massive, unprecedented cash advance for his next 3 projects. He wanted a deal that guaranteed him complete creative immunity. To get that massive check, he enthusiastically signed an exclusive 5-year contract with the studio. He bragged about that contract to every trade magazine in town. He called it an ironclad guarantee of his artistic freedom. He was incredibly arrogant, and arrogance almost always skips the fine print. Malcolm and I had read that contract thoroughly. We read every single addendum, every footnote, and every hidden clause. In exchange for the millions of dollars in upfront cash, the studio's legal team had quietly inserted a brutal mechanism of absolute control. Clause 4, Section B, was the ultimate trap. It explicitly stated that the studio retained the unilateral right to immediately freeze all production, halt all marketing, and suspend the artist indefinitely in the event of an unresolved ethical dispute or a significant intellectual property conflict. Furthermore, if the artist was suspended under this clause, they were legally barred from working for any other competing studio or production company for the remainder of the 5-year term. Finally, every single dollar of the massive cash advance had to be repaid immediately. Trevor had signed it without hesitation. He assumed he was untouchable. He assumed the studio would never dare invoke such a draconian clause against their most visible, profitable star. He firmly believed the corporate entity existed solely to serve his needs. He completely failed to realize that contracts are incredibly agnostic. They do not care about celebrity status. They only care about who possesses the legal authority to enforce them. Trevor thought he had locked the studio into funding his lavish lifestyle. He did not realize he had handed them the exact legal weapon needed to completely paralyze his entire career. He had sold his professional freedom for a momentary surge of cash. He had built a heavy, golden cage, stepped inside, and enthusiastically handed the keys over to a faceless corporate board. Now, he was standing on a stage, boasting about the very document that was about to destroy his livelihood. I watched him smile at the flashing cameras, entirely oblivious to the ticking legal time bomb strapped to his own chest. He locked his own cage. The room grew dim as another promotional clip played on the large screens. I watched the meticulously edited footage, my mind drifting away from the gala and back to the quiet, windowless room where my real work began. When I walked away from Kenneth and Cynthia 4 years ago, I did not take a vacation. I took a vow of absolute silence. I rented a small, unassuming office above a defunct bakery. It smelled permanently of stale air and cold, bitter espresso. That tiny room became the headquarters of my new life. I stopped attending auditions. I stopped taking meetings with producers who only wanted to cast Trevor's sister. Instead, I sat at a heavy wooden desk, illuminated only by the harsh glare of my laptop screen, and I began to write. I wrote under a carefully guarded pseudonym. I created new worlds, structured intricate narratives, and crafted complex characters. The industry, obsessed with youth and visibility, completely ignored my physical absence. but they aggressively bought my anonymous words. My pseudonym quickly became one of the most sought-after script doctors in the city. The money from those ghost-written drafts flowed directly into the anonymous holding companies Yvonne had structured. As the funds accumulated, I did not upgrade my lifestyle. I upgraded my leverage. I began quietly purchasing the intellectual property rights to forgotten scripts, discarded novels, and stalled independent projects. I bought the underlying assets of the industry. I became a landlord of narratives. When mid-tier production companies faced bankruptcy, Yvonne stepped in and bought their debt for pennies on the dollar. We acquired their distribution catalogs and their unproduced slates. We were not building a traditional Hollywood production company. We were building a financial labyrinth. Every shell corporation led to another shell corporation, all ultimately pointing back to a single blind trust, the trust that held my name. While Trevor was busy hiring paparazzi to photograph him leaving expensive restaurants, I was busy reading quarterly financial reports and analyzing the SEC filings of the studio that financed him. I learned the language of corporate acquisitions. I learned how to identify the precise structural weaknesses in a company's financial foundation. I traded the fleeting validation of applause for the permanent security of ownership. I spent thousands of hours in that small office, surrounded by stacks of legal binders and empty coffee cups. I forged an empire out of paper, ink, and absolute secrecy. The industry thought I had simply faded into a tragic, irrelevant memory. They did not realize they were renting their stories from the ghost they had buried. I owned the foundation. The foundation of Trevor's current success was built on a very specific lie. I knew he had stolen my 8-year-old script. What I did not fully understand was how he legally managed to push it through the studio's rigorous clearance department. 2 weeks before the gala, Malcolm found the answer. He had walked into my office, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He dropped a thick, manila folder onto my desk. It contained the complete chain of title for Trevor's new film. The chain of title is the legal history of a script, proving exactly who owns the rights at every stage of development. "Look at page 42, Malcolm had said quietly. I flipped to the page. It was a standard intellectual property transfer agreement. It explicitly signed over all my past, present, and future rights regarding that specific screenplay to Kenneth's management company. And at the bottom of the page, resting on the dotted line, was my signature. I stared at the ink. I had never seen that document in my life. Malcolm pointed to the margins. Your father had you sign hundreds of standard performance contracts when you were young. He slipped the signature page into one of those stacks. But he made a mistake. Malcolm laid a second document next to the first. It was a genuine contract from the same year. He highlighted the differences. The font on the transfer agreement was slightly larger than the signature page. The margins were misaligned by exactly half an inch. The printer ink on the body of the text was a different chemical composition than the ink on the signature line. It was a crude, desperate forgery. But Kenneth's fatal error was the notary stamp. The notary who allegedly witnessed you signing this transfer was registered in Nevada on that exact date, Malcolm explained, his voice turning cold. We have the state logs. The notary was not in California. You were filming on location in Toronto, and Kenneth was in Los Angeles. The three of you were never in the same room. My father had not just stolen my work. He had committed federal fraud to secure it. He had forged a legal document to permanently strip me of my intellectual property, handing my creative soul over to Trevor on a silver platter. He assumed I would never have the resources or the legal backing to audit a major studio's clearance files. I looked at the forged signature. A younger version of me would have wept at the profound betrayal. The current version of me simply closed the folder and locked it in the safe. I did not confront him. I did not send an angry email. I simply added the felony to my arsenal. The paperwork was flawless. A loud burst of applause pulled my attention back to the gala stage. Trevor was stepping aside, gesturing for his lead actress to take the microphone. She was the influencer who had stolen Ivy's role. She stepped up to the podium, her smile blindingly bright, her designer dress sparkling under the heavy spotlights. "Working with Trevor has been the absolute highlight of my career," she gushed, her voice perfectly pitched for the microphones. "He is a visionary. He created an environment on set that was so supportive and so empowering." She looked directly at Trevor, her expression radiating deep admiration. The crowd cooed at the display of professional affection, but from my vantage point in the shadows, I could see the subtle, rigid tension in her shoulders. I could see the way her eyes darted nervously toward Kelsey, who was standing near the front table, watching her with the cold, calculating gaze of a prison warden. The influencer's glowing praise was completely hollow. It was a mandated performance. During our covert audit of the studio, Yvonne had uncovered the details of the actress's management contract. Kelsey's agency represented her. The contract was a masterpiece of modern exploitation. It stipulated that Kelsey's agency took a staggering 40% of her gross income. It dictated her diet, her public appearances, and her approved speaking points. Worse, it contained a highly specific promotional cooperation clause. The actress was legally obligated to publicly praise Trevor. She was forced to participate in manufactured paparazzi setups, pretending to have a close, flirtatious friendship with him to generate free marketing for the film. If she deviated from Kelsey's script, she faced ruinous financial penalties. She was not a rising star. She was a highly paid hostage. Trevor and Kelsey had built a toxic ecosystem that systematically consumed young women. If a woman refused to comply, like Ivy, she was brutally crushed and discarded. If a woman surrendered, like the influencer currently speaking, she was drained of her autonomy and turned into a compliant mouthpiece. They used these women to build a facade of progressive, empowering Hollywood success, while privately operating a relentless machine of psychological and financial abuse. I watched the actress finish her speech. She forced a final, radiant smile, but as she turned away from the cameras, her face immediately dropped into an expression of sheer exhaustion. She walked back to her seat, carefully avoiding Ivy's gaze in the corner. The entire gala was a monument to their unchecked cruelty. Everyone in the room was either a participant in the abuse or a victim forced into silence. They were all smiling, drinking champagne, and celebrating a massive, glittering lie. I checked my watch. The time for silence was ending. The illusion was breaking. The morning before the gala, a courier had arrived at my secure office building. He delivered a heavy, unmarked cardboard box directly to my assistant. There was no return address, but the handwriting on the shipping label was unmistakable. It was Cynthia's elegant, sweeping cursive. I carried the box into my office, locking the door behind me. I cut the tape and opened the flaps. Inside lay a chaotic pile of USB drives, printed email threads, and bound financial ledgers. For a brief, fleeting second, a very old part of me wondered if this was an apology. I wondered if my mother had finally experienced a crisis of conscience. Perhaps seeing Trevor steal my script had been a bridge too far, even for her. Perhaps she was finally choosing her daughter. I plugged the first USB drive into a secured, offline laptop. It contained dozens of recorded phone conversations. I clicked on an audio file dated 3 weeks prior. Kenneth's harsh, demanding voice filled my quiet office. "We need to restructure the family trust before the premiere," he was saying. "I want Cynthia's access restricted. Move the primary beneficiary status entirely to Trevor and Kelsey. Cynthia is getting too anxious about the audit. I need her locked out of the accounts. I stopped the recording. The cold truth settled over me. Completely unsurprising but perfectly clear. Cynthia had not sent me this box to save me. She had sent it to save herself. She had discovered Kenneth's plan to financially discard her and transfer the family's wealth entirely to the golden child and his wife. Cynthia was facing the exact same financial exile she had happily inflicted upon me 4 years ago. She did not feel guilty about the forged contracts or the stolen money. She was simply using me as a weapon to destroy Kenneth before he could destroy her. She assumed I would use these documents to file a public lawsuit, creating a massive scandal that would freeze the family assets and prevent Kenneth from moving the money. She wanted me to be her attack dog. I looked at the sprawling pile of evidence. There were emails proving Kenneth's knowledge of the forged notary. There were bank statements showing the exact routing numbers where my childhood earnings had been funneled. It was a goldmine of legal ammunition. I took the evidence, but I did not accept the unspoken apology. I would use her greed to finalize my strategy, but I would never let her back into my life. She had not chosen me. She had simply chosen the side that was currently losing less. Have you ever received an apology that was actually just a manipulation? Let me know in the comments below if this resonates. I closed the box. At 9 a.m. on the day of the premiere, I sat in the glass-walled conference room of our firm. The Los Angeles skyline stretched out below us, bright and smog-free. Malcolm and Yvonne sat across from me, reviewing the final, consolidated binders. The hostile takeover was fully funded. The SEC filings were prepared. The proxy votes from the studio's frustrated minority shareholders were legally secured. We had the power to stop the gala entirely. Malcolm tapped his pen against a legal pad. We can file the injunction right now. Luna. A federal judge will sign the emergency order by noon. The studio will be legally forced to cancel the premiere tonight. We can seize the film's distribution rights before Trevor even puts on his tuxedo. Yvonne nodded in agreement. Financially, it is the safest route. We lock the assets immediately and prevent them from spending any more of the marketing budget. I looked at the two of them. They were giving me excellent, sound legal and financial advice, but an injunction was a private, bureaucratic victory. It would allow Trevor to play the victim. He would tell the press that a jealous sister had used legal loopholes to sabotage his art. He would spin the cancellation into a narrative of his own martyrdom. No, I said, my voice quiet but absolute. We do not cancel the premiere. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Luna, if he screens that film tonight, he publicly claims your intellectual property. He establishes a public record of ownership. Exactly, I replied. I want him to claim it. I want him to stand in front of hundreds of entertainment journalists and explicitly state that he wrote every word. I want him to firmly plant his flag on stolen ground. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. If we stop him now, he is just a man who had a premiere canceled. But if we let him speak, he becomes a man who intentionally committed public fraud. He will provide the exact testimony we need to trigger the ethics clause in his exclusive contract. He will build the gallows, and he will put his own neck in the noose. Yvonne smiled slowly, closing her binder. She understood the strategy perfectly. We let him have his moment. We let him have his stage. I confirmed. We let him insult me. We let him soak in the applause. Because the higher he climbs tonight, the more devastating the impact will be when the ground simply ceases to exist beneath him. I was not going to the gala to suffer another humiliation. I was going to the gala to collect a confession. Trevor was about to perform the most important monologue of his entire career, and he had no idea he was speaking directly into my trap. The countdown had officially begun. We let him speak. To understand how an entire Hollywood production can be dismantled in a single evening, you must first understand the true nature of power in this industry. Most people look at the billboards, the magazine covers, and the red carpet interviews, and they mistakenly believe that visibility equals authority. They think the actor smiling on the poster holds the leverage. They are entirely wrong. Power in Hollywood is not measured in social media followers. It is measured in paper. A week before the gala, Malcolm had stood in front of the whiteboard in our secure office, drawing a complex diagram. He was explaining the concept of a chain of title. It is a sequence of legal documents that proves absolutely who owns the intellectual property of a script, from the very first draft to the final cinematic release. If the chain of title is broken, Malcolm had explained, tapping a blue marker against the board, the film essentially does not exist. Distributors will not touch it. Insurance companies will not bond it. The studio cannot legally monetize a single frame of the footage. Kenneth and Trevor had foolishly relied on a forged transfer agreement to complete their chain of title. They had submitted fraudulent paperwork to the studio's clearance department, assuming no one would ever audit the original source. But I did not just audit it. I weaponized it. Through the network of anonymous holding companies Yvonne managed, I had systematically acquired the preferred shares of the very studio financing Trevor's film. I bought out their outstanding debts. I secured proxy votes from a dozen frustrated minority shareholders who were tired of the studio's reckless spending. By the time the sun set on the day of the premiere, I had accumulated a 51% controlling interest in the studio's parent corporation. I did not need to ask the board of directors for permission to act. I was the board of directors. The Securities and Exchange Commission filings had been submitted and legally processed at exactly 4 p.m. that afternoon. Once the digital timestamp hit the Federal Registry, the transaction was entirely irreversible. The corporate structure was officially altered. Every single executive, every producer, and every actor working under that studio banner now technically answered to me. Trevor believed his face on the screen made him a titan. He did not understand that I owned the screen, the projector, the distribution rights, and the very ground the theater was built on. He thought he was untouchable because he was famous. I knew he was exceptionally vulnerable because his entire career was built on a fraudulent foundation of stolen intellectual property. I sat at my isolated table in the gala, running my finger over the smooth leather of my briefcase. I did not need to shout to be heard tonight. I did not need to engage in a messy, emotional argument with my family. When you hold the irrefutable, legally binding documentation of a federal crime, your voice does not need to rise above a whisper. True justice is incredibly bureaucratic. It is clean, precise, and completely devoid of sentimentality. I was not here for revenge. I was here for an audit. The paperwork was absolute. A sudden, sharp murmur rippled through the grand ballroom, starting near the heavy mahogany entrance doors and quickly spreading toward the front tables. The string quartet faltered for a fraction of a second before recovering their rhythm. The blinding flashes of press cameras, previously focused entirely on Trevor, abruptly shifted their trajectory toward the back of the room. The heavy doors had swung open, and Philip stepped inside. Philip was the notoriously reclusive chairman of the massive media conglomerate that heavily partnered with Trevor's studio. He was a titan of the industry, a man who rarely attended public premieres unless it was to signal a major corporate victory. He was flanked by two stoic legal advisors and a personal security detail. His expression was incredibly grim, his jaw set in a tight, unyielding line. Up on the stage, Trevor's face lit up with a mixture of shock and profound arrogance. He quickly adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo, a triumphant smile stretching across his face. He leaned into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trevor announced, his voice booming with forced humility. "I am incredibly honored. It appears we have a very special guest joining us tonight, the man who helped make this entire cinematic vision a reality." Trevor genuinely believed Philip had broken his reclusive habits simply to bask in the glory of the premiere. He thought the chairman had come to personally validate his genius in front of the Hollywood elite. Kenneth and Cynthia, sitting in the front row, puffed out their chests, practically vibrating with parental pride. They were already calculating how to leverage Philip's appearance for their next public relations push. They were all completely misreading the room. I watched Philip's rigid posture as he navigated the crowded floor. He was not looking at the stage. He was not looking at Trevor. He was not here to celebrate a cinematic masterpiece. He was here because he had been legally compelled to attend. Just 4 hours prior, Malcolm had hand-delivered a massive binder of SEC filings directly to Philip's executive suite. The binder contained the undeniable proof of the hostile takeover. It clearly outlined the sudden, aggressive shift in the studio's controlling shares. Furthermore, it detailed the devastating flaw in the film's chain of title caused by Kenneth's forged signature. Philip was a ruthless businessman. He understood instantly that the multi-million-dollar film he had partially financed was currently resting on stolen intellectual property. He knew that any attempt to distribute the movie would result in catastrophic federal lawsuits. He did not come to the gala to applaud Trevor. He came to officially acknowledge the new, absolute authority in the room, strictly to protect his own remaining corporate assets from the fallout. Trevor extended his arms wide from the podium, waiting for the chairman to approach the stage for a highly photographed embrace. The press corps leaned in, hungry for the perfect shot of the industry's passing of the torch. I remained seated in the shadows. I watched Philip walk right past the front row. He did not stop. The air in the ballroom seemed to thicken, turning dense and unbreathable. Trevor's outstretched arms slowly began to lower as he realized Philip was entirely ignoring his invitation. The triumphant smile frozen on Trevor's face morphed into a mask of sudden, visible confusion. "Philip," Trevor called out, his voice wavering slightly over the sound system. It was no longer a booming declaration. It sounded dangerously close to a question. Down in the front row, Kenneth half stood from his chair, his brow furrowing as he tried to catch the chairman's eye. Cynthia gripped her evening clutch so tightly her knuckles turned white. Kelsey, standing near the edge of the stage, frantically motioned for a publicist to intervene, sensing that the carefully orchestrated narrative was rapidly derailing. But Philip kept walking. He bypassed the velvet ropes separating the VIPs from the rest of the attendees. He ignored the frantic whispers of the studio executives, who were desperately trying to understand his trajectory. He moved with the heavy, reluctant steps of a man walking to a corporate execution. He was heading straight for the darkest corner of the room. He was heading for the table near the service doors. If you are ready for the absolute truth to drop, hit that like button and let me know you are still with me. I did not wait for him to arrive. I uncrossed my legs and reached down to the floor. My fingers wrapped around the cool, sturdy handle of the leather briefcase. The metal clasps felt heavy and reassuring against my palm. I picked it up and placed it squarely on the table in front of me. Then, I slowly stood up. The movement was completely silent, yet it felt as though it echoed across the entire ballroom. For the first time all evening, the peripheral lights caught the edge of my profile. A single, sharp click of a camera shutter broke the quiet. Then another, and another. The press corps, trained to follow the highest concentration of power in any room, instantly realized the chairman of the board was ignoring the star of the film to approach a woman standing in the shadows. Trevor gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles pale, He stared at me, his eyes wide, finally recognizing the sister he had publicly humiliated just 20 minutes ago. I saw the exact moment the sheer impossibility of the situation crashed into his manufactured reality. I did not offer him a smile. I did not look at my parents, who were now staring backward, their mouths slightly parted in shock. I focused entirely on the approaching executive. The physical atmosphere of the gala had completely fractured. The celebration was dead. The room was no longer a movie premiere, it was a boardroom. And I was the only person holding the agenda. Philip stopped exactly 2 feet in front of my table. I held his gaze. The silence in the Beverly Hills ballroom was absolute. 200 of the most influential people in Hollywood were collectively holding their breath. Philip stood before my table. He was a man accustomed to making demands, a man who built careers and destroyed them with a single phone call. But right now, his shoulders were stiff, and his eyes carried the distinct, heavy resignation of total defeat. He understood the lethal precision of the legal documents Malcolm had delivered to him. He knew he had been completely outmaneuvered by a woman the industry had written off as a tragic casualty. He did not offer me a patronizing smile. He did not extend his hand for a warm, photographic handshake. He simply offered a brief, incredibly formal bow of his head, a gesture strictly reserved for acknowledging a superior authority. "Ms. Luna," Philip said. His voice was low, meant only for my ears and the immediate vicinity. But in the dead quiet of the room, it carried. Up on the stage, Trevor leaned forward, straining to hear, his face flushed with a dark, panicked red. Kenneth had completely stood up from his chair, looking around frantically for security, unsure of what protocol to invoke. Philip reached into his tailored jacket and produced a single, thick envelope bearing the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He placed it deliberately on the table, right next to my leather briefcase. "The transition documents have been fully authenticated," Philip whispered, his tone utterly devoid of emotion. "The proxy votes were certified at 1600 hours. The board has formally acknowledged the acquisition." He paused, glancing momentarily toward the stage where Trevor was unraveling. When Philip looked back at me, his expression was a mix of reluctant respect and grim reality. "The studio has been yours since midnight," Philip concluded softly. "They simply haven't realized it yet." I placed my hand flat over the SEC envelope. I did not thank him. Gratitude implies a favor was granted. This was a hostile takeover. I had bought this authority with years of silent, relentless labor and impeccable financial strategy. "Thank you for confirming the receipt, Philip," I replied evenly, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "I suggest you advise your distribution partners to halt all promotional spending immediately. We have a significant legal discrepancy to address regarding the core intellectual property of this film." Philip swallowed hard, nodding once. He knew exactly what I meant. He turned on his heel and walked toward the exit, his security detail parting the sea of stunned guests. He was abandoning the sinking ship before the hull completely shattered. I picked up my leather briefcase. I stepped out from behind the shadowy table and walked directly into the blinding glare of the main aisle. The press cameras erupted into a chaotic frenzy of white flashes. I did not shield my eyes. I walked with a slow, measured cadence, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I was heading straight for the podium. Trevor watched me approach, paralyzed. I took the stairs. I reached the center of the stage. Trevor was gripping the microphone stand as if it were a life raft. He looked at me, his eyes wide and unfocused, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The arrogance that had fueled his earlier speech had completely evaporated, replaced by the stark, raw terror of a man who suddenly realizes he does not understand the rules of the game he is playing. Luna, what are you doing? Trevor hissed under his breath, leaning in close. Get off the stage. Security is going to drag you out. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or acknowledge his threat. I simply reached out and placed my hand firmly over his on the microphone stand. I applied a steady, unyielding pressure until his numb fingers uncurled. I took the microphone from him. I turned to face the blinding lights of the press corps and the sea of shocked executives. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the audio equipment. Good evening, I said. My voice echoed through the massive speakers, calm, dignified, and entirely devoid of malice. My brother spoke very passionately tonight about the grueling, deeply personal creative process behind this film. He called it his legacy. I set my leather briefcase on the podium. The heavy metallic clicks of the latches opening echoed sharply across the room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of paper bound in a blue legal cover. This is the core intellectual property of the film you just watched, I stated clearly, holding the document up for the cameras. It contains the exact dialogue, the precise character arcs, and the fundamental structural narrative. I opened the cover and displayed the second page. A massive digital projection of the document appeared on the LED screen behind me, courtesy of Yvonne, who had quietly commandeered the AV booth during the confusion. If you look at the federal timestamp at the bottom of the page, I continued, pacing my words like a quarterly financial report, you will see that this script was officially registered with the United States Copyright Office exactly 8 years, 2 months, and 14 days ago. A collective gasp swept through the front tables. Journalists immediately began snapping photos of the projected document, zooming in on the undeniable federal seal. I turned slightly to look at Trevor. He was pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a cornered animal. Trevor did not spend years agonizing over these words, I said, returning my gaze to the crowd. He did not write them. He stole them from my private office when he needed a project to save his failing production company. I paused, letting the absolute weight of the federal document crush the glittering illusion of the premiere. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply delivered the empirical data. This is not his legacy, I stated, the silence of the room amplifying every single syllable. I wrote it. The silence shattered. The chaotic frenzy of camera shutters sounded like a torrential downpour inside the silent ballroom. Trevor backed away from the podium, his breathing ragged and uneven. The projection of my 8-year-old copyright registration loomed massively behind us, casting a cool, blue light over his terrified face. He looked frantically around the room, searching for an ally among the executives he had spent years trying to impress. Every single face staring back at him was entirely blank, calculating the exact legal distance they needed to maintain to avoid the collateral damage. "This is completely absurd!" Trevor suddenly yelled, his voice cracking violently. The sudden volume was jarring against the absolute stillness I maintained. "You cannot do this. I am the star of this studio. I have a 5-year exclusive contract. It is ironclad. You cannot touch me, Luna, and neither can they." He pointed a shaking finger at me, desperately clinging to the legal document he thought was his ultimate shield. He genuinely believed that because he had commanded a massive cash advance, the corporate structure would automatically protect him from the consequences of his own theft. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I simply gave a very slight nod toward the AV booth at the back of the room. Yvonne was waiting. The massive LED screen behind me instantly shifted. The copyright registration vanished, replaced immediately by a high-resolution scan of a highly classified legal document. It was Trevor's heavily publicized, supposedly ironclad exclusive contract. "Your contract is indeed very comprehensive, Trevor," I said, my voice echoing clearly and evenly through the microphone, particularly the addendums regarding ethical compliance. I used a small laser pointer, directing a sharp red dot to a densely worded paragraph near the bottom of the projected page. Clause 4, Section B. I read aloud, my pacing deliberate and precise. The studio retains the unilateral right to immediately freeze all production, halt all marketing, and suspend the artist indefinitely in the event of an unresolved ethical dispute or a significant intellectual property conflict. Hey, Trevor stared at the massive screen, his jaw going entirely slack as he read his own signature at the bottom of the page. He had signed it enthusiastically, completely ignoring the fine print because he never imagined the studio would ever leverage it against him. He never imagined I would be the one holding the remote control. Furthermore, I continued, moving the laser pointer to the final sentence of the clause. Upon suspension for an ethical violation, the artist is legally barred from seeking employment with any competing entity for the remainder of the 5-year term, and every single dollar of the upfront cash advance becomes immediately payable. The silence in the room deepened into a suffocating pressure. The executives sitting at the front tables instantly recognized the flawless execution of a corporate guillotine. Trevor had not just lost his movie. He had legally signed away his right to work anywhere else in the industry, and he was completely financially ruined by the debt of the advance he had already spent. Trevor looked at his hands, realizing the cage he had so proudly built for himself had just snapped shut. He had demanded exclusivity. I was simply enforcing it. This is slander. A shrill, frantic voice pierced the quiet of the room. Kelsey shoved her way past a bewildered security guard and marched toward the edge of the stage. Her carefully crafted composure had completely shattered. Her designer dress looked suddenly ridiculous against the backdrop of absolute corporate ruin. She pointed her phone at me, clearly recording, desperately trying to reclaim control of the narrative. You are just a bitter, unstable woman trying to ruin your brother because you could not make it yourself. Kelsey shrieked, playing directly to her online audience. Everyone knows you had a complete mental breakdown. I am calling my lawyers. I am calling the press. We will destroy you for this. I looked down at her from the stage. She was weaponizing the exact lie she had spent the last 4 years paying to amplify. She thought volume and social media outrage could defeat a federal contract. I reached back into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a second, thinner folder and dropped it onto the podium. Before you call the press, Kelsey, you might want to review the invoices, I said calmly. The LED screen behind me shifted again. The image of Trevor's contract was replaced by a collage of financial documents. They were wire transfer receipts and highly detailed email chains originating from Kelsey's boutique media agency. These are the monthly payments you authorized to 3 different offshore server farms, I explained to the captivated room. The corresponding emails detail your exact directives to trend-specific negative hashtags regarding my mental health, and to systematically plant false stories about my financial ruin. Kelsey froze mid-sentence. The phone in her hand lowered slightly. The influencers and media personalities sitting near her physically leaned away, treating her like a sudden, toxic liability. Her entire brand was built on female empowerment and authenticity. The screen behind me proved she was nothing more than a digital assassin. But that is not the worst thing you and your husband did, I continued, my voice dropping to a colder, harder register. I looked directly past Kelsey, finding the dark corner near the service doors. I looked at Ivy. The screen flashed one final time. It displayed a recovered, time-stamped video file. It was Ivy's original, breathtaking audition for the lead role in the film. Next to it was an internal studio server log, showing the exact moment Trevor's administrative account had ordered the permanent deletion of her file, immediately followed by her demotion. You built an ecosystem that systematically exploited young women who refused to serve your ego. I stated, the absolute truth ringing through the ballroom. If they said no, you erased them. If they complied, you drained them. The current lead actress, the one who had just given a glowing speech about Trevor's visionary genius, slowly stood up from her chair. She looked at Trevor, then at Kelsey, her face pale. Without saying a single word, she turned her back on them and walked purposefully toward the exit. The facade was entirely gone. The system was unmasked. There was nowhere left for them to hide. I looked at Trevor. He was completely silent. Hold everything. Stop this immediately. Kenneth's voice thundered from the center aisle. My father was practically sprinting toward the stage, his face a mask of purple, desperate rage. He was closely followed by a man holding a sleek, silver briefcase, the family's longtime entertainment attorney. Kenneth stopped at the bottom of the stairs, breathing heavily. He looked up at me not with the pride of a father, but with the pure, unadulterated hatred of a man watching his primary investment burn to the ground. He had spent his entire life managing the narrative, and he absolutely refused to lose control of the room. You have no authority here, Luna, Kenneth declared, projecting his voice so the journalists in the back could hear. He gestured sharply to his lawyer. Show them the document. Show them she owns absolutely nothing. The attorney quickly opened his briefcase and pulled out a single, yellowed sheet of paper. He held it up. We have a legally binding family likeness and intellectual property release, signed by Luna herself, the attorney announced to the room, trying to sound authoritative despite the overwhelming tension. It explicitly surrenders all rights, past and future, to any projects developed under the family management company. She waived her ownership 12 years ago. A low murmur rippled through the press corps. The journalists leaned in, smelling a sudden, dramatic reversal. Trevor, still gripping the podium, let out a shaky, desperate breath of relief. He looked at his father as if Kenneth had just thrown him a life preserver in a hurricane. They thought they had found the ultimate loophole. They thought a piece of paper from the past could erase the fortress I had built in the present. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with my father. I simply stepped back from the microphone and allowed Malcolm to step forward. Malcolm did not raise his voice. He did not wave documents in the air. He simply placed a pristine, white folder on the podium and leaned into the mic. That document is a fraudulent construct, and presenting it in a federal corporate dispute is a severe felony, Malcolm stated, his voice carrying the clinical precision of a surgeon. The LED screen behind us immediately displayed a side-by-side forensic analysis. The signature page was lifted from a standard television release form. Malcolm explained calmly, pointing to the magnified sections on the screen. The font kerning does not match. The ink composition is from 2 different decades. But most importantly, the notary public whose stamp is on that document has provided a sworn affidavit. A copy of a sworn legal statement appeared on the screen. The notary was physically logging documents in Carson City, Nevada, on the date in question. Malcolm concluded. Luna was on a closed set in Toronto. Kenneth was in Los Angeles. The document is a blatant forgery, created specifically to steal intellectual property. The silence that followed was absolute. The lawyer standing next to Kenneth slowly lowered his arm, staring at the screen in horror. He instantly realized his client had just handed him a forged document to present in front of hundreds of witnesses. The lawyer took 2 deliberate steps away from my father. Kenneth's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The false counterattack had lasted exactly 30 seconds. It did not save them. It simply added a federal fraud charge to their rapidly expanding list of profound failures. The life preserver was made of lead. The complete structural collapse of a Hollywood ego is an incredibly quiet phenomenon. There are no explosions. There is no dramatic, physical altercation. It happens in the subtle shift of the room's gravity, in the sudden turning of shoulders, and in the collective realization that power has permanently changed hands. I stood at the podium, looking down at the people who had spent my entire life trying to erase me. Trevor was gripping the edge of the stage, his knuckles stark white, staring at the floor as if he expected it to open and swallow him. Kelsey was furiously typing on her phone, likely trying to delete the digital evidence Yvonne had already archived. Kenneth stood frozen in the aisle, completely abandoned by his lawyer, his face slack with the realization that his fraudulent empire was gone. "This concludes the public audit of this production," I said quietly into the microphone. I reached out and pressed a small button on the podium's console. Behind me, the massive LED screen went completely black. For 3 seconds, the ballroom was plunged into an eerie, waiting darkness. Then, a single, crisp image illuminated the room. It was no longer the glowing, highly stylized poster of Trevor's stolen movie. It was a minimalist, sharp, silver logo. The logo of the anonymous holding company I had built from the ground up in that tiny, coffee-stained office. Beneath the geometric design, in stark white lettering, it read, "Chairwoman and Controlling Partner, Luna." The visual shift was an absolute, undeniable confirmation of reality. It was the digital raising of a new flag over conquered territory. Simultaneously, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom opened again. A team of 6 security personnel, dressed in sharp, unmarked black suits, stepped quietly into the room. They did not belong to the hotel, and they did not belong to Trevor's public relations team. They belonged to the new executive board. They belonged to me. 2 of the guards walked with measured, professional strides down the center aisle. They bypassed the murmuring journalists and the stunned executives. They walked directly to the front row, stopping in front of the highly coveted velvet-roped VIP section. One of the guards calmly reached out and unclipped the gold-plated name tag that read, "Executive Producer Trevor," from the back of the center chair. He dropped the tag silently into his pocket. "Sir," the guard said, his voice low and incredibly firm, "the studio has requested that you and your immediate party vacate the premises. The premiere has been officially suspended pending a full legal review." Trevor looked up at the guard, then up at me on the stage. His eyes were completely hollow. The golden child had finally hit the boundary of his own manufactured reality. There was no one left to blame. There was no script left to steal. There was no father left to forge a document to save him. He slowly let go of the stage, without a single word. Trevor turned and walked up the aisle. Kelsey followed him, her head bowed, shielding her face from the relentless flashes of the press cameras. Kenneth and Cynthia trailed behind them, looking small, old, and entirely irrelevant. I watched them walk out of the doors. I did not look back. The fallout of a corporate takeover does not happen in the press. It happens in the quiet, sterile environment of a boardroom, buried under mountains of paperwork. 1 week after the gala, the Hollywood news cycle had already moved on to the next scandal. But the legal reality for my family had just begun to set in. Trevor was officially bankrupt. The studio had invoked the penalty clause of his exclusive contract, demanding the immediate repayment of his massive, multi-million-dollar cash advance. Because he had spent the money on luxury cars and a lavish lifestyle, his accounts were frozen, He was legally barred from working for any other production company for the next 5 years. His career was completely immobilized by the very document he had once proudly flaunted. Kenneth and Cynthia tried to monetize their sudden downfall. They quickly shopped a tell-all memoir to major publishing houses, promising to reveal the dark, twisted secrets of their ungrateful daughter. They did not get a single offer. Malcolm had anticipated their move. He proactively sent cease and desist letters to every major publisher in the country, attaching proof that my holding companies exclusively owned the rights to all family archival materials, photographs, and historical narratives associated with my brand. Kenneth and Cynthia had nothing left to sell because I legally owned the copyright to our shared history. But destroying their toxic ecosystem was only the first half of my strategy. The second half was dismantling the damage they had left behind. I sat in my new executive office overlooking the studio lot. Yvonne walked in, carrying a stack of thick, heavily tabbed binders. They were the results of the comprehensive forensic audit I had ordered on Trevor's past productions. We did not just look at the budgets. We looked at the human cost. Trevor and Kelsey had operated a systematic machine of professional erasure. Yvonne opened the first binder, sliding a spreadsheet across my desk. It listed dozens of names. There were junior writers who had drafted entire acts of Trevor's films, only to have their names stripped from the final credits to make him look like a solitary genius. There were production assistants who were forced to work 80-hour weeks without overtime pay. There were wardrobe designers who were bullied into signing away their intellectual property. The total for the back pay is significant, Yvonne noted, pointing to a number at the bottom of the page. But the studio accounts are perfectly healthy. We can clear the deficit by Friday. I looked at the long list of erased names. I knew exactly how it felt to watch someone else take the stage while you stood invisible in the shadows. I knew the quiet, devastating humiliation of having your hard work legally consumed by a larger, louder ego. Process the payments, I instructed Yvonne, signing my name on the authorization line. And contact the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild. I want every single one of these credits officially restored on all digital databases and streaming platforms. We were not just balancing a ledger. We were rewriting the history they had tried to bury. We were returning the stolen currency of recognition. The ghosts were visible. The massive sound stages on the studio lot felt different. The frantic, fear-driven energy that had characterized Trevor's reign was entirely gone. In its place was a steady, focused hum of actual creative work. I had officially restructured the production company, dissolving Trevor's vanity label and establishing a new entity, an independent funding and production house specifically dedicated to protecting vulnerable artists. We implemented strict, non-negotiable human resources protocols. We banned the use of predatory public relations contracts. We created an environment where leverage could never again be weaponized against talent. The first order of business was addressing the stolen lead role in the upcoming film. I did not simply fire the influencer and hand the role back to Ivy. That would have been replacing Trevor's nepotism with my own brand of favoritism. Ivy deserved better than a handout. She deserved validation. Malcolm assembled an independent casting board comprised of 3 veteran, highly respected directors who had absolutely no financial ties to my holding companies. We provided them with the original, recovered audition tapes, including Ivy's deleted file, and asked them to evaluate the performances strictly on artistic merit. The decision was unanimous. Ivy was the undeniable choice. When Yvonne called Ivy to offer her the standard, highly protective studio contract, Ivy wept, not from fear, but from the profound relief of finally being evaluated fairly. She stepped onto the set 2 days later, her posture completely transformed, radiating the quiet confidence of a woman who knows she earned her place in the room. To celebrate the restructuring, I hosted a private dinner. There were no flashing cameras, no velvet ropes, and no reporters asking intrusive questions. It was just Malcolm, Yvonne, Ivy, and myself, sitting at a simple wooden table on the rooftop of the main studio building. The Los Angeles sunset painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and violet. The air was warm and smelled faintly of eucalyptus from the nearby hills. We ate grilled salmon and drank a moderately priced, excellent white wine. We laughed about the absurdities of corporate law and shared stories about the chaotic early days of our careers. I looked around the table. For 35 years, Kenneth and Cynthia had aggressively taught me that family was an unyielding obligation, a biological debt that had to be paid with endless compliance and silent suffering. They convinced me that blood was the only metric of loyalty. They were completely wrong. The people sitting at this table did not share my DNA. They did not demand my sacrifice to inflate their own egos. Malcolm and Yvonne had protected my blind side for years, demanding nothing but professionalism and strategic clarity. Ivy had looked at me with genuine respect, not as a stepping stone. This was not a network of corporate associates. This was my chosen family. We were bound not by biology, but by mutual respect, shared integrity, and the quiet understanding of what it takes to survive in a ruthless world. I raised my glass, the crystal catching the fading light of the sun. I felt a deep, unfamiliar sense of absolute peace settle into my chest. The rooftop was perfectly quiet. I finally belonged here. The rooftop eventually cleared out, leaving me entirely alone under the vast, starless Los Angeles sky. The studio lot below was silent, the massive sound stages casting long, heavy shadows across the pavement. I sat in a comfortable chair, a single desk lamp illuminating the small circular table in front of me. Next to my empty wine glass lay a plain white envelope. It had arrived earlier that afternoon, slipped into the studio's general mail system. There was no return address. I carefully slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was neat, slightly hurried, and completely unfamiliar. "Dear Luna," the letter began. "You do not know me. I am a junior copywriter in the television department. I was in the back of the room at the premiere last week. I spent the last 7 years watching powerful men take credit for my dialogue. I watched them accept awards for the jokes I wrote at 3 in the morning. I was taught to stay quiet and be grateful for the exposure." I traced my finger over the blue ink. The words resonated with a painful, universal frequency. It was the collective voice of the scapegoats, the invisible architects, and the women told to shrink themselves so someone else could stand tall. "When you stood on that stage," the letter continued, "you didn't just take back your script. You proved that the shadows do not have to be a permanent grave. For the first time in my entire career, I actually believed that the door might finally open for someone like me. Thank you for keeping the receipts." I folded the letter slowly and slipped it back into its envelope. For decades, I had internalized the lie that cutting ties with a toxic family was an act of profound selfishness. I had believed that if I just worked a little harder, sacrificed a little more, and remained perfectly compliant, I would eventually earn their genuine love. But toxic systems do not reward compliance with love. They reward it with more exploitation. Sometimes, the most courageous thing a person can do is to stop trying to fix a burning building and simply walk out the front door. Blood does not entitle anyone to your sanity, your financial security, or your intellectual property. I looked out over the sprawling studio that now belonged to me. The empire I built was not a monument to revenge. It was a fortress of absolute independence. Legacy is not what you inherit from the people who came before you. Legacy is the environment you actively protect for the people who come after you. I picked up the envelope and held it gently in my hand. I thought about Kenneth and Cynthia, sitting in their empty, quiet house, frantically trying to figure out how to maintain an illusion that no longer existed. I thought about Trevor, trapped in a legal cage of his own incredibly arrogant design. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. I felt nothing but the clean, crisp air of a newly acquired freedom. I tell stories. This time, I get to keep my name on them. The night was completely mine. If you believe that true justice is best served silently, on paper, share this story. Thank you for listening.